Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
I'm Stephen Carroll, and this is Here's Why, where we take one news story and explain it in just a few minutes with our experts here at Bloomberg. Since the Hamas attack on Israel on the 7th of October and the war in Gaza that's followed, tensions in the Middle East have been running high, with little sign of improvement.
Israel is threatening further military action after striking Hezbollah targets in Lebanon in response to a rocket attack that killed a dozen young people in the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights.
Hamas says Israel killed its political leader Ismail Haniyeh in an airstrike on Tehran.
The recent headlines have been dominated by repeated attacks, assassinations, and fears of a wider regional war. But in the background, there's also been talking, negotiations over a truce in Gaza, and attempts to de-escalate the conflict between Israel, Iran, and the Hamas and Hezbollah groups, which are backed by Tehran. So here's why diplomacy still matters in the Middle East. Our head of Middle East and North Africa coverage, Stuart Livingstone-Wallace, joins me now. Stuart, there's been so much violence over the past few months. What are diplomats doing about it?
So it's basically been an escalation, I would say, certainly on the military front, but particularly on the diplomatic front. Now, it's also true to say that diplomacy has a thread that's been running pretty consistently in the region, but particularly since this all sort of started, or this latest phase started in October. But really, we've had these two assassinations, one in Beirut of the Hezbollah leader and one of Haniyeh, who was one of the Hamas's political leader in Tehran. And I think the feeling was that Iran would have to retaliate in some fashion, and because it was so deeply embarrassing for someone of Haniyeh's stature in Tehran, who had been invited to the inauguration of the Iranian president, basically gets assassinated under their noses. So it's not a great look for them. And I think the fear was that Iran would have to respond, or felt it would have to respond far more aggressively than it did in April. So the April incident was the one where it sent something in the order of 350 drones and missiles directly at Israel, and now they were successfully intercepted almost without exception. But the real worry was that if they did something even bigger than that, however well calibrated they thought it would be, you had an exponential increase in the risk that it would hit a target or hit a population that was perhaps not intended, but would in turn force Israel to respond on an even grander scale. So you've seen lots of leaders come in. Now you have the usual actors that you've seen in the last several months, of people like Antony Blinken, but I think more importantly, you have Russia that has sent its former army chief down to Tehran for discussions. You have the French president, again, contacting Iran directly. And I think the messaging around this is very clear. Please do not escalate. There is nothing to be gained from escalation. And what's interesting is that, at least so far, it seems to be working.
What about progress towards a broader ceasefire or truce in Gaza? What sort of progress has been made in those discussions?
I think there were worries that when Haniyeh, that is the Hamas's political leader, was assassinated, they gave that job to basically the leader in Gaza, Sinwar. And Sinwar is sort of the hardliner on this. I mean, they kind of all are hardliners, but he is a particular hardliner. He's also perceived as one of the masterminds of the October 7th attack on Israel from Gaza. The reality is that he was probably making most of the final decisions on the ceasefire negotiations in any case. So I think our big takeaway from this is that, yes, it clearly was Hamas trying to send a message to the wider world of what their intention was, but at the same time, it probably didn't change the ultimate decision maker. I think the feeling within certainly diplomatic circles trying to de-escalate the situation is that you have to have some sort of resolution in Gaza before you can hope to make progress on any of the other multiple conflicts. Now, particularly Lebanon, that is one that continues to worry us, particularly Yemen. Gaza and what's happened in Gaza since October has really been the foundation for a lot of the rhetoric around why these groups, and they are for the most part Iranian-backed, are unleashing these assaults on the wider region. And I remind everyone, it's not just Israel that they're attacking. There is this ongoing series of attacks on commercial shipping moving through the Red Sea, the Gulf of Oman, and so on. And that really has had a global impact. Has progress been made? I mean, We hear repeatedly from particularly the US administration that they're getting closer. There's no reason to disbelieve that. But again, there is a fundamental block here, which is that Israel has said that it must, or its intention is, that it must destroy the Hamas leadership and ensure that Hamas can never again have any sort of sway in Gaza before it's prepared to accept some sort of peace. Obviously, its counterparty in those negotiations is Hamas, that is very unlikely ever to agree to that. So whether they can find some sort of path to some sort of peace remains to be seen.
The top US diplomat, Antony Blinken, Secretary of State, has made many visits to the Middle East since last October. How important is US influence in this region?
Extremely is the short answer. I mean, it's waxed and waned over the years. So it looked fairly clear a couple of administrations ago, probably starting with Obama, but then certainly into Trump, that the US appetite for sort of mass deployments in the Middle East was very much diminishing. Now, in part, that was a function of the fact of the rise of China. And there were obviously going to be increasing pressure over the next several years in the Western Pacific. And enormous though US military power is, it couldn't necessarily deploy on the scale it needed to, both in the Middle East and in the Pacific, as well as many other places. And so you saw this move out of the region, I would say, somewhat by the US. You had the Abraham Accords, which are these sort of peace deals between some of the Arab nations and Israel. And in some respects, that was the US trying to find some sort of balance of power in a scenario where the US would remain present, but perhaps not on the scale that people got used to in previous years. Now, clearly, that's been derailed pretty dramatically by what's been happening in Gaza and elsewhere in the region. And so the US has had to effectively move back into the region. It's sent in a carrier strike group. It's sending in squadron of fighter jets. It's having to send in additional destroyers. So in some respects, it's had to U-turn as a function of the fact that this threat is now spreading right across the region.
Who are the other key actors in the diplomatic efforts?
Well, the other one we haven't mentioned to date, and who is a very, very weighty actor in all of this, is Qatar. And Qatar is often the one that gets forgotten about. Now, I mean, just to set the scene for people, this is a relatively small sliver of land that juts out into the Persian Gulf, but by the end of this decade, they're going to be controlling something like a quarter of the world's liquefied natural gas supply. Now, with all this money that has come in the last, I suppose, 25, 30 years, they are building out on several fronts. So the one I suspect everyone is aware of is obviously hosting the World Cup. But they've obviously been buying companies, they've been buying real estate all around the place. But the other key thing that they're doing is becoming effectively one of the major negotiators and mediators in the region. So they've been involved in all sorts of things, everything from hosting the Taliban to hosting Hamas, and that obviously was done in coordination with the US. They host a gigantic US base. They host a very substantial Turkish base, and they're really kind of the mediators between lots and lots of warring parties all over the world. Now, they're key in this one because they were, or they have been and continue to be, one of the really strong players in these ceasefire negotiations. They were certainly one of the mediators involved in the rather short-lived ceasefire that we saw several months ago that led to the release of some hostages and a temporary cessation of hostilities in Gaza. And they continue to do so.
OK, Stuart Livingstone-Wallace, our head of Middle East and North Africa coverage at Bloomberg, thank you. For more explanations like this from our team of 2,700 journalists and analysts around the world, search for Quick Take on the Bloomberg website or Bloomberg Business app. I'm Stephen Carroll. This is Here's Why. I'll be back next week with more. Thanks for listening.